Hello, Bronwyn Lund here from BronHolm Tours. I'm on the island of Bornholm and I make 360 video walking tours of the island for people who either can't get to the island or can't get around the island. And today we're actually filming the summer version of the Hammershus walking tour. So I really hope you enjoy the tour. As you can see, the castle has an amazing vantage point over the Baltic Sea, and just on the horizon, we can't really see it very clearly today, it's very hazy, is Sweden. And Sweden is only 37 kilometres away from Bornholm at this point. So that is essentially why the castle was built on this vantage point, as a defence against being taken over from enemy attackers. So we're just going to go down and go through the visitors centre first, which has just recently opened a couple of years ago, and tells a little bit about the history of the castle before we go up into the castle itself. We can see a few sheep over here in the field, and the funny thing is that all the land around the castle is still privately owned, so often you'll see sheep wandering in amongst the ruins of the castle. Not sure if we'll see any today, but certainly when you do a walk around the surrounds of the castle, there'll be cattle or sheep as you're walking along. So the visitors centre blends in with the environment, and it's actually a very clever piece of architecture. And when we go up into the castle, we'll have a vantage point where we can look back and see how the visitors centre very much blends into the side of the hill on the opposite side from the castle. And the whole idea behind the architecture of the visitors centre was that it was going to be all about the castle and not about the visitors centre. So the architects have really achieved that. So the roof of the visitors centre is essentially a lookout boardwalk, and it gives an incredibly clear view of the castle. I just wanted to come over here and point out a few things about the castle before we actually go into the visitors centre itself. One of the things to take notice of is that the path leading up to the main entrance of the castle, which is on the other side of the castle, is very crooked. And the reason why the path is so crooked is because that made it very difficult to get a battering ram to go up into the castle. You needed a straight road in order to use a battering ram, and the crookedness of this path made that impossible. The other thing to take note of is the different building materials that were used by the castle and used for the castle. And here we can see that about half of the castle is built with red brick and the other with stone. And that's actually because the second half of the building was done by the Hanseatic League later on, after the castle was taken over. And the Hanseatic League were also responsible for building the extra defence walls around the castle, so the towers that are further down the hill, and also the gatehouse, which is just above the waterways there. So now we'll go down in and visit the visitors centre and see what it has to say about the castle. first thing that strikes you as you walk into the visitor centre is not only the castle, but also this massive replica of a skull. And, it's actually speaking now. And the reason why the architects decided to put a skull in the middle of the visitors centre is to really commemorate the fact that Hammershus has never been a very pleasant place for the people of Bornholm. It has really been a place of persecution and a place where it was very difficult for the Bornholm peasants to have the presence of the castle. And here it actually gives the years of the various entities that were in power at the castle, and we'll just walk through those different phases of the castle. And it says, "A reason to hate. In the Middle Ages, a dark cloud fell over Bornholm as the king and the church waged a bitter conflict for power. Hammershus is the visible proof of the strife that prevailed. The huge castle rose from a cliff top 74 metres above sea level, casting a long dark shadow over the people of Bornholm. Hammershus served as a castle for 500 years. First, in the Archbishop period, it was the power base of the church. Then, in the Lubeck period, it became the home of greedy merchants, before the king's brutal vassals moved in during the vassal period. In the castle, prisoners were jailed and tortured. It was not without reason that for many years the people of Bornholm harboured a profound hatred of Hammershus." So it was a pretty dreadful place for the people of Bornholm. So the first stage was the crown and the church at war. In the late 13th century, Denmark was plagued by intense discord between the king and the church. On one side was the crown and on the other side the church, which had become powerful by virtue of the vast amounts of land it possessed, the blessing of the Pope and costly gifts from the nobility. Caught in the middle of the conflict was Jens Grand. He was Denmark's religious leader and Archbishop of Lund in the Danish county of Scania. It was probably Jens Grand who commissioned the construction of Hammershus. With bricks and mortar, the bishop made it quite clear who held the power in the southern Baltic. During the Middle Ages, one king after another attempted to seize control of the castle. Some of them settled in it for a short period of time, but all of them ended up surrendering it to the church. It remained the period of the archbishops, and it was not until 1522 that King Christian II got his hands on the castle and the huge revenue it provided. But he did not seize the power. New actors were standing in the wings. They took to the stage when King Frederick I toppled the king. It was goodbye to the archbishops. The period was controversial because experts still disagree on when Hammershus was built. And there is actually evidence that Hammershus was built by Valdemar, and then Valdemar actually lost it to the bishop during one of the internal wars. So then, from 1576 to onwards was the greedy merchants. The Hanseatic League was a powerful alliance of market towns which controlled a large share of trade around the Baltic Sea. Throughout the Middle Ages, merchants from the Hanseatic ports had shown great interest in Bornholm. The island was important if they were to get their hands on trade in the southern Baltic Sea. They regularly came to trade and to plunder the people of Bornholm. In 1525, the merchants of Lubeck got their chance. They were given Hammershus as a guarantee by King Frederick I, whom they had helped to power. The new lords and tormentors of the people of Bornholm were both inventive and active. They immediately started to expand Hammershus into a modern medieval fortress. The finances for the building came from sky-high taxes. The people of Bornholm took care of the gruelling construction work under duress. The oppression led to a rebellion against the merchants of Lubeck, but the rebels were emphatically defeated. It was not until 1576 that the last Lubeck bailiff reluctantly had to leave the island when their guarantee expired. During the 15 years that the merchants dominated Hammershus, they made a distinctive mark on both the castle and Bornholm. With the departure of the merchants of Lübeck, the Lübeck period and the Middle Ages were at an end, but the oppression continued. So then from 1576 to 1660, it was the beginning of the end. By 1576, Bornholm once again belonged to the Danish crown, and Hammershus housed a series of vassals during the vassal period. On behalf of the king, they collected taxes and conscripted Bornholm peasants for forced labour. The desperate people of Bornholm complained time and again to the king about their unfair conditions, but he did not listen. The vassals exploited their power and became richer as Hammershus perished around them. It was their duty to maintain the castle, but they shirked the agreement. It was the beginning of the end of Hammershus as a fortress. Under the vassals, the castle served as the administrative centre for Bornholm. It was the site of the island's courtroom, prison, and for the unfortunate, the gallows. Despite the official functions, Hammershus was in a terrible condition. The vassals hated living there and began to live in more luxurious manners. But that was not an option for the prisoners in the castle. They had to await their fate under miserable conditions, and it was not until the 18th century did the castle cease to be a state prison, which was its final function. Then there's some information about Leonora Christina, and there's also information up in the tower about her, so I won't read that out. There's actually 2 panels devoted to her. She was the daughter of the king. But what I really wanted to point out here is something that I think is valuable for all the films that I'm doing on Bornholm, and it is actually a map of the medieval trade routes in the Baltic Sea. So we have the Baltic Sea here on the right, and all the way around and through the top of Denmark and out to the North Sea, which goes over to England. So you begin to understand that with Russia on one side and England on the other, this was a very, very important area for trade. And right smack in the middle is Bornholm, and that's actually here, and we can see on the red mark where we're actually standing. You can see how close we are to Sweden, but also to northern Germany and what is now Poland. The rest of the visitors' centre is an interactive display, and I'm not sure how well the camera will function in this area because it's not really good in low light situations. But it just says, a castle was a demonstration of force, shouting out to passers-by, beware, here it is, I who am in charge. It was intended to greet the enemy and tackle war, because human ingenuity knew no bounds when it came to waging war. The castle's first protection against enemies was nature. The cliffs are steep and the road up to the castle's eastern gate was a winding one, so it was impossible to run up and break the gate down with a battering ram. It was possibly the merchants from Lübeck who added the round towers to the castle with embrasures for firearms. In the late 16th century, the use of cannons was widespread, and despite constant improvements, the medieval castle had become outdated. From the start, the castle was planned with a series of walls which enemies had to pass through. Walls and ramparts constituted a fatal obstacle course. This is why a siege was the best way to conquer a medieval castle. So then it just goes into what has happened in the modern history. So from 1822 onwards, it was a time for forgiveness. By 1684, Hammershus had played out its role as a castle, and the island's defence forces moved to Christiansø and Frederiksø. And that was essentially because a castle defence had become obsolete, and it was naval defence that determined the power of a nation. So King Christian IV actually moved the defences of the country out into the middle of the Baltic to better control the Baltic Sea. The materials for the construction of the new fortresses came from Hammershus. The once mighty fortress became the island's quarry. Finally, the detested castle gave something back to the people of Bornholm in the form of construction materials. The years passed, and in 1813 Denmark suffered state bankruptcy as a result of a severe economic crisis. Overnight, the sins of the past were forgotten. Hammershus was ready to assume the role of a national romantic symbol at a time when Denmark was rediscovering itself. In 1822, Hammershus was declared a listed building and restoration started in the late 19th century. The once hated walls were treated to some tender loving care. It was high time. The ruin was about to crumble from the impact of the elements, which were always the castle's most relentless enemy. Today, Hammershus is regularly maintained and loose stones are reset with new homemade lime mortar, which is actually based on a recipe from the Middle Ages. And that is how we ensure that the castle is ready to receive between 400,000 and 500,000 visitors a year. And today we know that Hammershus is a living history museum. For centuries, people in and around Hammershus left traces which have survived to this day. Precious plants were carefully moved to the island where new residents settled there. The plants represent the living history of how they used to poison enemies, cure illnesses and season their food. Around Hammershus there are 53 species of plant, all of which were introduced when the castle was in use. Many of them are only extant here. We look after them as we look after the ruins. They are living, vulnerable relics of the past. And there was henbane, which was an important part of the medieval medicine cabinet. The poisonous plant is versatile and used for everything from sedation to deadly poisoning. Wormwood was a treasured plant on Bornholm. It has been used to combat moths and intestinal worms and as an ingredient in Bornholm's national drink, Wormwood bitters. And the beautiful salsify was probably introduced in the Middle Ages. The flower's root is edible, but because the plant is extremely rare, it's forbidden to pick or eat it. So let's go out to the castle and have a look at the ruin itself. As we're going up the windy path into the castle ruin, I just wanted to point out this monument which is directly in front of us, which is made out of some Bornholm granite. And it's actually a monument that was erected in 1908 by Christian X, one of the kings of Denmark, to commemorate all the freedom fighters who have either died or given their time and energies to keeping Bornholm Danish. It's mostly to commemorate the liberation of Bornholm from the Swedes in 1658. And what actually happened in 1658 was that the Danish king had a war with the Swedish king and lost. And that meant that he lost quite substantial territories of the country and had to give them over to Sweden, including Scania, which is now and has remained part of southern Sweden, or Skåne as it's called in the Scandinavian languages. So he lost Bornholm as a part of that treaty to the Swedish king. And a Swedish commander came over from Sweden to take over the castle, and he had a garrison of men. He had 100 Swedish soldiers with him, and this was in February of 1658, and 6 months later half of the Swedish soldiers had died, of disease and other things. And the Danish freedom fighters had been, a lot of them were priests actually of the local churches, had secretly been in contact with the Danish king, and they were given permission to take back Bornholm. So during the 6 months that Bornholm had been Swedish, the commander had probably developed quite a good relationship with the local mayor in Hasle, and they waited until he went out with only his manservant to go and have dinner with the mayor in Hasle. And then while he was having dinner with the mayor in Hasle, he was arrested by the freedom fighters in the name of the Danish king, but he actually escaped and made it down to Rønne. And then one of the freedom fighters apparently was a little bit trigger happy, and he shot the man dead in the street. And that apparently wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be a peaceful takeover. We're just going through the gatehouse here. This is all what remains of the gatehouse. And anyway, so they came back up to the castle here at Hammershus, and they arrested the second in command and took back the castle and redeemed Bornholm back into the Danish crown. And it has been a part of the Danish crown ever since then. And as we saw in the visitors' centre, there was a lot of warring going on, and it was a very prized piece of land, this little island. Now in front of us we have what was the courthouse, and it may be the oldest building in the castle. And here the Hammershus moot was held. The moot was the court of the entire northern part of Bornholm, and there were 2 gallows outside the castle. So I guess one of the things that could cheer you up if you were going to be hung was that at least you would have a lovely view as your neck was being strangled. So of course when we have guests staying with us on the island, we always bring them to the castle if they haven't been here before. And one of the things that my husband likes to do is play a bit of a trick on the guests and walk over towards this vantage point here and pretend to fall off the edge of the cliff. But when you actually get to the edge, it's not that much of a drop. It's only a metre and a half. But we have a fine view here out across the Baltic Sea, and we can't see it very clearly today, but on a clear day when it's not so hazy, we can actually see Sweden. And Sweden is only 37 kilometres away from this point of the island. So it would have been relatively easy in the Middle Ages and later times to cross the sea and attack the castle. But the castle is on a pretty formidable strategic defence point, as you can see. We'll go into the castle and have a look at another vantage point where we'll be able to see the harbour, which is over to the right, just hidden by the trees, where the supplies and ships came in to supply the castle. And there is actually quite a lovely walking path all the way along down to the harbour, and I have done a walking tour of that path. So check that out. I'll put the link into the description of this film so you can enjoy that walk along the coast. It's a winter walk, which is actually quite good because the trees don't have leaves on them, so it's actually a much better view of the water. Now here we are, we're coming into the castle proper now, and you can see how much the path winds around to what would have been the main entrance of the castle. And what we're going to do on this walk is I'm going to walk around the opposite way to the way we walked in the winter walk, just so you can get a better feel for how the castle looks from another angle. And so here it says the castle gate is the main entrance to the castle yard. It consisted of a square tower with steep gables. At the beginning of the 17th century, a rampart was built in front of the gate. In 1645, the castle was captured by the Swedes. Their entry is said to have been made through the Swedish Hole, seen further down the wall. So we'll go and have a look at that hole. And that particular takeover in 1645 lasted a very, very short time, because the Swedes took over the castle, and then meanwhile in another part of Scandinavia the kings had made a treaty because they had yet again had another war, and Bornholm came back into the hands of Denmark again at that time, only to have another war a few years later and actually lose Bornholm again to the Swedes before it was taken back 6 months later in 1658. So here we have the storage house, and in the Middle Ages the peasants paid taxes first to the archiepiscopal see in Lund and later to Lubeck. Payment was effected in kind, which was kept in the storage house, oxen on the ground floor and grain on the other floors. So this is a massive storage house, and we can actually see the brickwork along the bottom of the parapet there, which shows that the Hanseatic League actually built further stories on. So they taxed the poor peasants even more than the bishops did. Another thing I've read on another source is that actually a lot of taxes were paid in butter, because there were a lot of cows on Bornholm and butter was easy to make and transport. I don't know how they would have stored it. Coming out now to the what was the prison in the corner of the ruin. And it's called Plum Tower, or Plum Tower. The Plum Tower is the most well-preserved building in the castle. It was made at the same time as the ring wall. At the top of the ring wall, close to the tower, are holes from a wooden watchman's gallery. In the basement were dungeons where the prisoners were kept until their case was tried. In the late Middle Ages, the lords of Hammershus probably also used the dungeons for punishing their servants. These rooms, or ruined buildings on the left as we walk along, were the stables and also a granary for the animals. And if we stand here, we can actually see that the wall is sticking out slightly compared to the other walls behind us and also in front of us. And that's because this was actually designed so that a cart could drive in and deliver the goods, and then drive out again and out of the castle gates. And there's a diagram here of how it would have looked back in the day. the stables. In the middle was a barn where the carriages could drive in at the one end, unload and drive out at the other. On each side of the barn were was a cow shed, and the stables for the draft horses of the castle respectively. And it might be a bit difficult because the sun might be blinding a little bit, but this is also an excellent vantage point to appreciate the visitors centre and just how it blends into the landscape. It's really quite an incredible piece of architecture. I really like the visitors centre. I think they've done an absolutely fantastic job. We'll go into the tower at towards the end of the tour. Now we're going to just walk around the outside and the back of the tower, and on our left is still the stables, but on our right is where the living quarters of the senior members of the army and the vassals of the king and the Hanseatic League that stayed in the castle for the time that they were trading would have lived. And the tower over the back here actually forms part of the kitchens. So we'll go in and have a look at that when we've finished looking at the ramparts here. So the ramparts have a fine view of the sea. So you could easily see enemies coming from from all sorts of directions. And over to the left here we have the west coast of Bornholm, and just down we can see a couple of jetties. And the big one is actually a disused quarry, which was used to quarry granite, but that stopped in the early last century. And again, you can see the lovely walk paths that you can take around the base of the castle and really get an idea for how formidable this castle was back in the day. And again, Sweden's only 37 kilometres away from this point, so a very important strategic vantage point at the time for the island. So they're currently renovating the north end of the tower. But down here we actually have the brewery and the bakery. So these were buildings that were actually separate from the living quarters and the tower itself. And so the scullery was where the brewery and the bakery of the castle were. In the Middle Ages, beer brewing and baking were the responsibility of the women. Close to the scullery was a slaughterhouse, a smokehouse, a salting house and a cooper's workshop. All tools and equipment were manufactured and repaired by the people living in the castle. And beer was actually the ration of the army, and the soldiers were rationed 2 litres of beer a day. And this was because the drinking water was unsafe at that time, and beer actually, the process of brewing the beer sterilised the water. So it was safer to drink beer back in the day than it was to drink water. this was the bakery. And we're just going to walk down to the southern corner of the castle and just have a look out at the vantage point. And at this point we actually have a nice view of the harbour. Now down here to the right was the water supply for the castle, and it's actually a spring. It's a spring of water. You can see the trees have certainly taken advantage of the water that is available in the spring. And so this is called Hunnatornel, or the Dog Tower. And these were the dungeons where the prisoners who were sentenced to death spent their last days before they were hanged on the gallows below the castle. In the 16th century, the arsenal containing weapons and ammunition was placed next to the tower. In 1645, there were 58 soldiers in Hammershus. And the small pond was important because it supplied the castle with water, and that's just over to our right. And just before we go up into the Dog Tower, I just wanted to point out this little hole, which is called the Swedish Hole. And this is the one that the sign outside the castle refers to, where the Swedes snuck in through this hole and took over the castle for a short time in 1645. Hi. Right, so here we are in the Dog Tower, and if I just stand on this rock, you can get a good view straight down into the water, and right in front of that craggy outcrop there is another interesting piece of rock formation, and it's called the Lion and the Camel's Heads, and they've sort of eroded away a lot now, but 100 years ago they did actually look like a lion and a camel. Now they look more like trolls. They might have to rename them. And then you can see the stairs that go down and around and off down towards the harbour. And if we just go across to this corner, we can actually get quite a good vantage point of the harbour and the lighthouse, which is behind the harbour on the other hill. So now we'll just walk around the remainder of the castle ruin and go in and have a look at the tower and living quarters of the higher ranks of the military, as well as, oh, there's a snake on the ground. It's a adder. You don't see those very often. That's very uncommon. So we have another tower over here on the left, vantage point. I just want to get up around this tree because I think it's good to have the approach into the tower from the angle of these rocks. So just have to bear with me if the sun's a bit blinding. apparently during the time of the vassals, who were particularly cruel to the Danish peasants, the Bornholm peasants, I think they thought they had it hard when the priests were in charge, but then when the king's vassals came along, they were just particularly cruel and particularly high on charging the taxes. So the gate of the Mantle Tower, or the Mantle Tower, was the only way of entry to the inner castle. The gate was equipped with a portcullis, and it could be closed from the inside by means of a heavy bar. Originally there were only 3 floors in the tower, the top floor being used as a private residence. The Ludbecker heightened the tower, so the Hanseatic League actually heightened the tower, and you can see where they heightened the tower from, because it's a completely different use of materials for the second sort of 2/3 of the tower, or half of the tower. And apparently the second floor was used by scribes, who that whole floor was just an administrative floor where the taxes were recorded that were brought in from the surrounding areas. And apparently when the vassals said to the scribes, "Oh, we're going to introduce a new tax law, we're going to increase the taxes," one of the scribes said, oh, I don't think that's a very good idea. I think the peasants are, already taxed enough." And he was subsequently hung for threatening to incite a peasant rebellion, which was punishable by death. So that was the end of that for that scribe. So I'm quite glad we don't have workplace arrangements like that anymore. So now we're inside the tower, and we can see where the wooden beams would have gone across to build the wooden floors to go up, and where the fireplace would have been as well. In this hole here, it was actually a prison where some of the more notorious prisoners were kept. And one of them was called Leonora Christina, and she was actually the illegitimate daughter of the king. So there were holes in the loft of the gateway from which it was possible to shoot and pour boiling slaked lime over the attackers. The Mantle Tower was also used as a prison. The king's daughter, Leonora Christina, and her husband, Count Corfitz Ulfeldt, were imprisoned here, suspected of high treason. They escaped by means of a rope from a window on the 3rd floor, but were caught again immediately. They actually did make it down to the harbour, but they couldn't get a boat there, so then they actually went over to Hasle. And but unfortunately they were caught when they got to the other town. Now, this is quite interesting in here because this was a staircase, and at the time you could actually go straight across the staircase into the room that was above the chapel. This is the chapel in here to the left, and that was actually the Great Hall, and that was the grandest hall in the castle at the time, but it's all gone now, of course. And this was another residence area. So we just go into the residential areas of the castle, and so all of these rooms over here to the left were rooms and quarters for the high-ranking officers in the military, and as I said before, the Hanseatic League and the king's vassals. And over here was the kitchens, and actually the lieutenant commander lived over the top of the kitchens. You can actually see there's a staircase going up here which would have gone to the residential rooms on top of the castle. And it says here the Lord Lieutenant's wing is thought to have replaced the Mantle Tower as a private residence. Below was the kitchen of the Lord of the Castle, and remains of a circular baking oven are preserved. An outside stair turret led up to the Lord Lieutenant's private rooms on the top floor. So we'll just walk past those and walk in and have a look at this kitchen, which was pretty big. And there's a small oven here where it would have been possible to push bread and other things in when you wanted to cook small things. But over here is actually the mouth of the oven, and all of this was the oven, and it was actually big enough to roast a whole cow or a whole side of beef or a whole side of pork in. And then you've got the back of the oven here. So we'll just go over and have a look at what remains of the castle chapel. And so we can actually see the staircase here that goes up, and then it sort of stops, and that's because the whole level here would have been timber. It was a timber balcony and balustrade that went right across the top of the chapel where the Great Hall was, and that was the grandest room in the castle. And here we have the porch of the chapel, and just in here there is a little oven, or there would have been a little oven which would have kept the chapel warm. And then we go into the chapel proper. So there were 2 floors in the chapel wing. Below was the chapel where the altar and the pulpit were placed in the east end, and above the royal hall, which was for some time the grand room of the castle. By the entrance to the castle is a carved symbol, St. Laurentius's grid. Laurentius was the patron of the Archiepiscopal See of Lund. So this chapel would have been here, of course, when the castle belonged to the bishopric of Lund. And that, of course, was before 1658, when Denmark lost Scania to Sweden, because Lund is now Swedish. And here you can see the arches, the beginning of the arches that would have soared up into the chapel. So it would have been quite a remarkable little place to come and worship. So now we're just going to walk back out of the tower and head over to another vantage point, and that's where I'll end the tour of Hammershus Castle. that was a summer 360 video walking tour of Hammershus Castle. Don't forget I've also done a winter version, so check that out. This is Bronwyn Lund from BronHolm Tours, signing off. Bye for now.